We're going to be looking at the lasting legacy of George and Mary Edwards Carpenter Lord, with eventual emphasis on Elgin Public Museum of Natural History and Anthropology, located, if you don't know, in Lord's Park on Elgin's east side. I have the honor of being the museum's current director and education coordinator, and in the 5.5 years that I've been working there, almost 3 now as director, I've gotten to know a lot about its history, although I will never claim to be the ultimate expert, and I am looking around the room and seeing a lot of people from the Elgin History Museum, and that makes me very nervous that they're going to point out a lot of things that I might get wrong. Well, perhaps the most fascinating thing about this museum's history is the 2 people who made it and Lord's Park happen, and that's, of course, George and Mary Lord, 2 very savvy, ahead of their time people, remarkably equal partners in spite of their highly gender-rolled times. I like to think of George and Mary as Elgin's first power couple. Make sure I hit the right button. So let's talk about George first. George Peter Lord was born in Leroy, New York, marked in red, on March 26, 1819. His parents were William Lord and Amelia Ely. The Lords were farmers, and as was typical in those days, George grew up working on the family farm. Also not atypical, he struck out on his own very young, about 14. And he went first to Buffalo, which, as you can see, wasn't too far from home. And at the time, Buffalo was a burgeoning city due to the Erie Canal having opened in 1825. It was a transportation hub for going west via the Great Lakes. However, George wasn't quite ready for the go west young man routine. He went from Buffalo all the way up to Portland, Maine for a time, and there, on July 16, 1846, he married Marcy Billings Hendee. And I'm really excited to show you this next slide because I'm not sure how often Marcy's image has been seen. We have an oil portrait of her at the museum, and it's kept in the collection storage room, and I took it out a couple of weeks ago just to take a picture of it so I could include her tonight. So for the first time in possibly quite a long time, here's Marcy Billings Hendee Lord. Marcy was born March 17, 1823, in Alden, New York. Her father was Homer Hendee. Her mother was Huldah Standish Washburn Hendee. Her 5 siblings' names were Eleazar Wheelock Hendee, Reverend Homer Hendee, Mary Washburn Hendee Morgan, Annette Hendee Woodard Brown, and Seelin Abner Hendee. And I tell you those names for a reason coming up, but you may have already figured it out. By the 1850s, George and Marcy were settled in Elgin, and they had a son, George Hendee Lord, in 1847. Sadly, the boy died in 1851 at the age of 3, and George and Marcy would have no other children. This is how Elgin looked in 1871 in a photograph I obviously stole from the Elgin History Museum, I'm sorry. And George Lord was right in the thick of all the rapid growth and development going on in the city at the time. He became one of the most productive, innovative, brilliant, respected, and ultimately generous citizens. And here's a look at some of what George Lord did in his time at Elgin. He started as a purchasing agent for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and as he started to make money and save some of it, which I guess is easier to do when you don't have kids, he invested in dairy farms in the area. He had an idea for something he called scientific farming, and I'm not sure what that entailed, but it increased butter production, and that made him even more money and garnered him more respect. Butter, of course, being a major key Elgin industry. And then he parlayed his money from the butter venture into becoming a real estate agent and developer. And now remember those names I just emphasized a short time ago. Mary's parents and siblings. George Lord developed at least some of the area as you're coming up from the National Street Hill. And before reaching Route 31 State Street to your south, meaning if you'd turn left coming up, there is Hendee Street and a Lord Street. They intersect appropriately enough. And if you instead go all the way up to where National becomes Walnut Avenue, that's where you see a lot of the streets that are still to this day named for Marcy's family members: Billings, Wheelock, Homer, Standish, Washburn, Morgan, and Woodard. Seems the only one of Marcy's siblings who didn't get a street named after him was Seelan Abner Hendy. Maybe he was the black sheep of the family. I don't know. They're also not marked on this map, but up where the Walnut Speakeasy is, there's one street I've circled, and it's not labeled, but that's Ely Street, and that was after his mother's maiden name. And all the other streets in that neighborhood are tree-related: elm, oak, orange, walnut, and orchard. And George would actually still be an active real estate agent after the turn of the 20th century into his 80s. Back to his impressive career trajectory, he also served as the business manager of the Elgin National Watch Company. It's said that he brought some renovations to the process that sent production levels much higher than those of comparably sized watch factories, and it became possible for workers to earn a living wage. This still wasn't the end for him. He also served many years as the president of the First National Bank, filled a 2-year term as Elgin's mayor, and was also president of the Board of Education for a year, 1884 to 85. But at that moment, in his mid-60s, his life hit a rough patch. Marcy took ill and died on February 7th, 1885. She was laid to rest at Bluff City Cemetery near their young son, George Hendy Lord. And these are their grave markers there. Perhaps this loss got George to thinking. He was wealthy and accomplished, but he had no children to leave his fortune to. Now he was a widower. And you can imagine the string of hopeful young spinsters who perhaps showed up at his door. I've brought you a pie, hoping maybe, But would he die a lonely man? Nope, because enter Mary Edwards Carpenter. Now, Mary was another native New Yorker, born August 19, 1832, in Chautauqua County, New York. Her family came to Illinois when she was very young and settled in what's now the Dundee Carpentersville area. In fact, her first husband was Julius Angelo Carpenter, for whom Carpentersville was named. And they would also have 3 young children, but just like George and Mary Lord, they died very young. The Carpenter family started up a little business called Illinois Iron and Bolt Company, where they manufactured many different items made of cast iron: heavy-duty springs, axles, drills, beams, you name it, and even irons for the modern housewife to press the family clothes. And with Julius and Mary's marriage, members of the Edwards family also became involved in the business too, and before you knew it, everybody was very wealthy. On this plat map, I've waited my whole life to do this. On this plat map, you can see that pretty much all of that whole area there is either owned by an Edwards or a Carpenter. So they own just about everything there for quite a while. But money doesn't automatically get you a long life, and Julius Carpenter died in 1880 at the age of 52. And he left his widow, Mary, approximately $250,000, which in today's money is about $8 million. So you might guess that there were some guys at her door with pies too. Well, most women in her position might have just said, I'm going to go live a life of luxury, but not Mary. She took over her husband's role as the treasurer of Illinois Iron and Bolt, apparently unfazed by any men who might have told her that she shouldn't do that, not woman's work. And she would actually still hold that job title at her death many years later. So, with neither of them looking to take financial advantage of the other, in 1889, 4 years after Marcy Lord's death and 9 years after Julius Carpenter's, George Lord married Mary Edwards Carpenter. And he was a very spry 70 years old at that point, and she was an energetic 57. They were both rich. Actually, she was richer than George. And between the two of them, they had exactly 0 children. So they decided to live it up. They traveled, they saw the world, they visited Europe. They went to visit family in New York that they had left behind so long ago. They went to the Alaska Territory, where George got some ideas that we'll come back to. They went to California by train, and on the way back, George made a very interesting purchase in a Denver curiosity shop, which we'll also discuss. They became collectors of all sorts of stuff, and one of those things was books. And at the museum, we have this book of Alfred Lord Tennyson poetry. and it has a nameplate inside. I don't know who inscribed it, if it was her or him, but it reads Mary Edwards, her maiden name. Christmas 1891 from G.P. Lord, 2 years after their marriage. And when they weren't traveling or adding new items to their collections, they were giving back to Elgin, and they became great philanthropists. Some of the Elgin institutions that the Lords made possible with their funding was a YMCA building, which was located downtown overlooking the Fox River. Gentlemen of a certain age in this town will tell you that they remember nude swimming was the norm in the pool. And it would remain for decades at that location before being torn down in the 1960s with the building of the Channing Y, which of course is now also gone. And there was the Sherman Hospital, the first true Sherman Hospital, and Elgin Academy, recently closed as Elgin Academy, but you surely recognize the old main building as the home of Elgin History Museum. And then there was the Old People's Home. They didn't mince words there, did they? They didn't call it an active senior community. It was just the Old People's Home. And you may recognize it as the Oakcrest residence still on State Street, and enhanced in more recent years by the new atrium addition. And something that has become all but forgotten over the years is that across the street from it is actually a city park called Central Park. And it's not used for much anymore, but it used to have a bandstand for concerts and walking paths through it. And I've also been told that up until recent years, kids would sled down that very steep hill hoping that they would stop just short of the railroad tracks, which doesn't seem like a very smart idea. Well, George and Mary bought that stretch of land to be a park simply because they wanted it to remain undeveloped so that the residents of the senior living community could look out across the river and still see how beautiful it was, see the church steeples of Holy Hill, and just the general wonderful panoramic view of their town. But then in the very early 1890s, George and Mary started to dream bigger. And there was a chunk of land across town on the east side that had formerly belonged to Dr. Joseph Teft. He farmed the land, but he was better known as Elgin's first physician. And after his death, some developers came along and purchased that land and intended to build houses on it, but were told it wouldn't be good for that kind of construction. So they offered it to the city of Elgin for a bargain price, hoping to unload it on them, and suggested, hey, make a great park. Well, the city put it on the referendum, on the ballot as a referendum, and they asked people, should we make this a park? It was shot down 1,414 votes to 521. It didn't help that at the time there was a terrible recession ongoing and people just didn't want to spend money on another park. But in October of 1892, believing this to be a golden opportunity, George and Mary purchased what was called Oakwood Park for $16,000, and they made the city of Elgin an offer they couldn't refuse. They would give this land to the city, and they would personally oversee making it into a magnificent park. There were, however, some rules, and we are expected to this day to obey the so-called Lord Covenants. Here we go. No alcohol, no political speeches, no mass assemblies, no funeral processions, no fortune tellers, no bicycles or racehorses going more than 6 miles an hour, and I didn't know you could put a speedometer on a horse. No flower picking, no gambling, no sleeping, and absolutely no kite flying. Well, I've seen plenty of the Lord Covenants flagrantly broken, including the kite flying, and I wish we could occasionally break the one about no alcohol so we can have a big fundraiser at the museum and get everybody snockered and get the checkbooks coming out. But the city accepted this offer, and George and Mary, but especially George, set about designing a park that would have some of the same amenities that he'd seen in parks in Europe and other places that he'd traveled. So this is a very rare and maybe even, I don't know, the only picture of the first Lord's Park Pavilion. It wasn't yet called Lord's Park, but there wasn't a lot of time to photograph it because it didn't stand for very long. George based it on a sort of log lodge that he had admired in Alaska, but he ordered it to be built of some kind of like log cabin. It was a tinderbox. It was just not safe. And within a year, it burned to the ground. So he immediately saw to rebuilding it, and you will recognize this second pavilion that took its place because it still stands today. And at this pavilion's dedication in 1898, George spoke eloquently of the importance of public parks. He said, "City life is a constant strain upon the nervous system, impairing its force and injuring the health of the people. The park is designed for a public resting place to which the people may resort for pleasure, rest, and recreation. From this standpoint, who can estimate its value or have a just conception of the beauties that may be derived from frequent and prolonged visits to its cool and refreshing retreats?" Well, by the time George said those words, he had already seen to many amenities in his park. He had created the lagoons where it had previously just been Willow Creek flowing through, and he designed walkways for strolling, and he built a bandstand for musical performances featuring newfangled electric lighting, which people thought was just a fad. And then there was a gazebo out on the island and in the lagoon, and there was a winter warming shelter up on the hill. And my one picture behind, what happened? I'm missing a picture. What happened to my picture of the Well, it's not here. At any rate, he also designed and stocked a zoo with all sorts of critters, both common and exotic. Deer, goats, rabbits, prairie dogs, owls, bears, possum, and even, believe it or not, alligators at Lord's Park Zoo at one time. In 1905, the first bison arrived, and bison are still the mascot animal of Lord's Park Zoo. So George had one thing left that he really wanted to do. He wanted to build a museum to store his collection and show off his collection. And I kind of think that maybe Mary was very much in favor of that because maybe she wanted some of that weird stuff out of her house. So I think maybe the museum is the first modern man cave, just guessing on that. But by this time, George was no longer a young man. And by the time they were ready to start construction on the museum in 1904, he was 85 years old. And even though Mary was 13 years his junior, she had serious heart and respiratory problems. While construction was ongoing, they traveled to a health sanatorium in Clifton Springs, New York, and thought that maybe over the winter they'd get better there. But Mary became worse. She couldn't travel back to Elgin when spring came, and she died at Clifton Springs on April 27th, 1905. And she was brought back to Elgin for burial at Bluff City. And as you can see, if you go there, and you can go there this weekend for the cemetery walk, isn't that right? There are Hendies on the one side, and there are Lords and Carpenters on this side. And they're all together. Earlier this year, when I did this presentation for a group, I had a crazy idea to flip open the Tennyson poetry book I showed you earlier and just see if something on whatever page I randomly opened it to might somehow sum up George and Mary's whirlwind 16 years of travels and fun and the lasting impact that they had on Elgin. Instead, I squarely landed on what George must have felt at Mary's death. And this is the tearjerker portion of our program, so please get your hankies out. Tears of the widower when he sees a late lost form that sleep reveals and moves his doubtful arms and feels her place is empty, fall like these, which weep a loss forever new, a void where heart on heart reposed and where warm hands have pressed and closed. Silence till I be silent too. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, it wasn't very long before George himself was silent. Without Mary, he faded fast. George Peter Lord died less than a year and a half later on September 14th, 1906. He was 87. Meanwhile, out in what would soon become known as Lord's Park, in their memory, construction was underway on the museum. But 2 months after Mary's death and the uncertainty of how it would all be paid for, the original plan had been scaled back. Originally, the 2-story building was to have a central atrium flanked by a west wing, plus a north wing jutting out the back, which is the top in this picture. And now it would just be an atrium and a west wing. The building's architect was David Postel, who also designed the second pavilion building, the David C. Cook building, the old Elgin High, and an addition to the watch factory, as well as several houses around Elgin. Postel planned a wonderful little neoclassic gem with ionic columns and pilasters, oak balcony railings, skylights, elegant archways with horsehair plaster scrollwork, and inlaid ancient Roman pattern mosaic tile floors. But still, construction came to a halt, and this is where it appeared to be ended in 1906. They had not built the main or second floor of the West Wing. They just slapped an awning over the basement. And that's underneath that is where my office is now. And another, by the way, in 1904, when they began, their first problem was a huge tree right where the steps are. So just like the universe itself, the museum began with a big bang. They dynamited the tree, and they kind of overdid it. Chunks of it went flying so far that some landed on roofs up on Forest Avenue, probably right about where you live, Mark. And then after George Lord's death in 1906, there was a new push to finish the West Wing. Think of all George and Mary Lord had done for the city, some noted. Wasn't it the least we could do to finish off their greatest and last dream of a public museum? And actually, money had been willed to the city to complete the project. It's just that some people didn't want to spend it. Like the mayor, Arwin Price, known as Elgin's drunk mayor, who freely admitted to buying drinks in exchange for votes. He derisively called the incomplete museum Elgin's white elephant. Grudgingly, though, amid city grumbling and labor squabbles, the West Wing was completed in 1907, but then the city didn't want to fund the actual operation of the museum. And so this lovely building sat unoccupied and poorly misused for the next 13 years. It was variously used as a storage place for maintenance equipment, as a secret city dog pound, and a winter indoor shelter for some of the animals of the zoo. And finally, in 1920, the local chapter of the Audubon Society made an offer to the city. They would open the building as primarily a bird taxidermy museum, but also exhibit George Lord's artifacts and whatnot, some of which had been waiting for over a decade, buried in hay, underneath hay in barns within the park. The city agreed to that, and at long last, on November 12, 1920, the Audubon Museum opened to the public with quite a turnout, and it was a very big hit, and it would remain so for a long time. Of course, in spite of George Lord's various things, the majority of the collection was birds, lots and lots of oids. And the photo at the lower left is of a passenger pigeon, a species that had gone extinct in 1914. It is still on exhibit today. And that Audubon emphasis had a very unexpected result just 4 years after the opening in 1920 that would forever link the museum with one of the most notorious crimes of the 20th century. In 1924, two young men named Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold kidnapped and murdered a 14-year-old boy named Bobby Franks in Chicago. These were two very well-to-do young men, both still teenagers at the time. They were both known for being extremely bright and accomplished students. They committed this terrible crime just because they thought they were smart enough to get away with it. But they made some crucial mistakes and left evidence behind. It's a fascinating story I won't go into tonight, but we have done presentations on it at the museum as recently as May, when it was the 100th anniversary of the crime. Nathan Leopold, at right in the photo, was an avid birder and collector of bird taxidermy. Being from a wealthy family, he had a fantastic collection of birds mounted by the best taxidermists money could buy. Famous lawyer Clarence Darrow managed to save Leopold and Loeb from hanging, convincing the judge to instead sentence them to life in prison. And when he learned his fate, Nathan Leopold, he's on the right in the picture, arranged for the bulk of his bird collection to come to Elgin Audubon Museum. And there was a bit of a public outcry at this because the victim had relatives in Elgin. Bobby Frank's aunt had been Rebecca Franks Eppenstein, and her husband was the head honcho of the Illinois watch case factory. Some people felt that accepting this collection of a murderer was glorifying him, and the museum should not take the birds. But the curator felt they comprised such a great collection he couldn't turn them down. So he struck a compromise. The museum would take the birds, but not label them as Leopold's, and the museum's records would not indicate him as the donor. To this day, a century later, we still know we must have many Leopold birds, but we can only identify 15 out of 1,500. And just as a side note, my Swedish grandmother was the family cook for the Eppensteins here in Elgin. And most likely she met that young victim when the families got together, but she died way long ago before I could ever ask her about it. Well, true to their word, the Audubon Museum did display George Lord's collection pieces that he intended for the museum. One of them is that little something that George picked up at the Curiosity Shop in Denver on his train ride. And this is the skull and antlers of an extinct giant Irish deer that came with some perhaps dubious provenance, even as George spotted it in a Denver Curiosity Shop. So the story went. It had been dug out of an Irish peat bog, and a priest was said to have brought it to America, intending to tour it around and charge people to see it. He got tired of lugging it around by the time he reached Denver, and he sold it to a curiosity shop. George Lord saw it and said, "I gotta have me that," and wanted it for his eventual museum, and so he had it shipped back to Elgin. George Lord also had 2 specimens of California condors, this being one of them, the big bird in the background. And these were purchased in about 1903 and brought to Elgin. And this is a species that almost went extinct in the 1980s. They were down to only a couple of dozen. Then they bounced back to about 500, but in the last few years, they've lost about a dozen or so to avian flu. So you never know. You got to keep at this long range to save the species. Well, as the years went on, people began donating a lot of curious things to the museum, and curators were not terribly fussy about what to accept. So some things were very good, and they fit the overall emphasis on natural history, with all sorts of preserved things coming in, and also Native American artifacts. On the lower left is a case totally filled with Native American clay pottery. On the top in the case is Tilly the bear. And Tilly was actually a resident of Lord's Park Zoo. And some boys were tossing around firecrackers one day, and she got scared and fell from her tree in the enclosure. When she hit the concrete pavement, the internal injuries killed her. So they put her in the museum, and I call her the Walmart greeter. She's the first thing that you would see back in the old days when you first stepped into the museum. Gradually, the museum's items began to morph from collection to clutter. And as local folks cleaned out their attics of mementos and miscellany saved for years, they began bringing unwanted items into the museum until the nickname Elgin's Attic took hold. And noted on carelessly kept inventories of early years are such items as a mass of molten nails said to have been from the Great Chicago Fire, war souvenirs ranging from muskets to swords to gas masks to potentially live mortar shells that eventually had to be very carefully removed by the police, and an obstetrical instrument made by a local blacksmith in 1842. There was china, and you can see the china cabinet there, in which there was said to have been a hen and basket butter dish that once belonged to Mary Lincoln, but could you prove that? D.C. Cook himself donated his childhood sled and velocipede bicycle, and then there were many sentimental items from pioneer living days, like spinning wheels, kerosene lamps, hand tools, farm implements, wagon wheels, tattered flags, fruit canning jars, wagons, ice skates, schoolhouse writing slates, and worn out but too cherished to be discarded dolls. Where would all of this end? Well, with going completely off the rails. In the 1930s and 40s, weirder and weirder stuff started coming into the museum, and that leads us to the museum's most infamous and most remembered exhibit of all time, which is the two-headed calf. So that came to the museum in the early 1930s, and it ushered in what I refer to as the freak show years. It seemed that to keep people coming, the curators were just turning to whatever brought them in. And now that's not to say that this didn't have some value, because it was real. It had been born on the farm of Fred and Emma Shear on Penny Road in Barrington Township. And such two-headed calves are not quite as rare as you might think. Around 1 in 100,000 births seems to be the best statistic I've found on it. It has been gone for 45 years now, but to this day, at least once a month, someone will come in and say, "Do you still have the two-headed calf?" We don't. It basically fell apart because it wasn't the best taxidermy job, and from what I've been told, when it was also infested with insects. So when they went to lift it one day, they lifted up from the belly, and that's what they got, and the legs were still just standing there. So it was time to go. There were also jars in those years of alleged human body parts, so-called ancient Egyptian mummy babies, which were eventually given to the Oriental Institute in Chicago, which found them to be, yes, ancient Egyptian, but not human. They were birds inside. And there was even a pair of very tiny adult Chinese shoes exhibited next to a pair of oversized clown shoes. Well, the result of all of this clutter and freak show was a dark, dismal museum in which attendance gradually dropped to nearly nothing. And the Audubon Society kind of abandoned it and put the museum back in the hands of the city, which by the 70s was ready to close it. And by then, nearing the end of the decade, a miracle happened. A new curator was hired, and some say the city's intent was that she went in there to inventory stuff just so they could sell it off and close the place for good. Well, Nancy Epping had not taken that job to see it be shut down. She immediately saw to new temporary exhibits like a moon rock and the Warrenville mammoth. And behind the scenes, she and a handful of committed volunteers began inventorying and getting rid of much of the junk. And they signed over to the fledgling Elgin History Museum those objects that did have some real significance to city history. And she also recognized the importance of becoming an educational partner with U46 and other school districts, so that soon there was a steady stream of field trips coming and bringing in revenue and complementing classroom education. The museum began to thrive again as she developed family programs and public events. Here you see an overnight stay for kids. Hunker down with your sleeping bag and have the taxidermy watch over you all night. And Nancy worked tirelessly to turn the museum around and operate it under an entirely new and professional paradigm. In 1982, Elgin Public Museum Incorporated, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, was formed. And since that time, the museum has operated with a board of directors and a staff led by executive director with whatever staff the budget will allow. And in return, the city of Elgin provides an annual operational grant in the form of a purchase of service agreement. But then tragedy struck. Nancy Epping was in a terrible car accident that meant she would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. And at that point, the only way to get to her office inside the museum was that spiral staircase you saw earlier. Well, Nancy had already been trying to think up ways that the museum might add on that east wing that had originally been intended. She used her terrible situation to go to the city to note that there was now a little something called the Americans with Disabilities Act, and she asked them to put an elevator in the building, since it really did need to be done anyway. When they told her, "Do you know how much an elevator would cost us?" her legendary reply was, "Do you know how much the federal lawsuit's going to cost you?" And so, rather than destroy anything of the natural original architecture, the city got on board with major fundraising efforts to make the East Wing finally happen. There were some very creative fundraising ideas in that period of time. There were coffee mugs. I have one on my desk. that showed the building as it was, and then the east wing magically appears when you pour the hot liquid in the mug. And of course, these buttons, showing you caught your eye. Where's the rest of the building? And this is one of my favorites, ping pong pool, in which people bought chances like lottery ticket and on numbered ping pong balls, a whole lot of ping pong balls, which were then thrown into Lord's Park Pool, stirred up by canoe paddles, and they drew out the winning numbers. So finally, the funds were raised, and that's Nancy at the groundbreaking ceremony. We still have the hat she wore that day and the shovel. And so this is how the museum looked from 1907 to 1998. And then here is how it looked at completion in 2000. And this is now officially Elgin Public Museum of Natural History and Anthropology. And we owe this to Nancy Epping, who paid a terrible price for it. Shortly after, Nancy was diagnosed with cancer, and she passed in 2003. And unfortunately, with her passing, the museum began to struggle a little again, because it was in that period of time that the Grand Victoria Casino Riverboat had just come, and they were providing a lot of funding to area nonprofits, including the museum. But then new gambling venues came along, and the money started going down, down, down. And at the time, the 90s boom in grant opportunities seemed to be drying up. It wasn't as easy to get grants. And in turn, with so many nonprofit organizations in this Elgin area, competition was and remains fierce for local fundraising dollars. The museum was hard hit. Paid staff had to be cut, both entire positions and the hours of the few that remained working. And by 2019, the eve of the museum's centennial year, there was word that maybe the city was about to close it down for good. And then a lot of things happened. We had some board members that, we were down to just several board members at that time, but those several members pulled together to convince the city that we would get our act together. And even when the pandemic came, we just hung in there. We hung in there really hard, and we worked really hard, and we managed to survive it all. And I'm pleased to report that Elgin Public Museum has been in the black each of the past 4 years, and we've begun very slowly but surely rebuilding our reserves. It may not be much black ink, but it's not red, and that's what counts for now. Now, with our extremely limited budget, one of my main concerns is that we need to make new things happen constantly. Too much remained the same for too long in those lean years. And a lot of people forgot that the museum even existed, and a lot of new people in town didn't know about it at all. So we've worked hard to publicize that we are there, and please come. And Sarah mentioned that I was named a professional rock star, and you know what? Here's my superpower: I'm cheap. I am so cheap. My first question to anything is, can it be purchased at Dollar Tree? I don't believe in going overboard on things. We just watch the money very, very carefully, and that's how we've gotten away with survival. And with this frugality and some much appreciated grants from lately, the Palmer Foundation, the Siegel Foundation, Davey Tree Service, and the DAR, we've been striving to update old exhibits and create new ones. So just to show you a few of the things we've done in the past few years, we put those 15 known Leopold birds to good use, because collectively they comprise one of our best teaching tools. We do a program for kids called Bird Adaptations, and these are perfect examples of this. Why do some birds have this kind of beak as opposed to that kind of beak, or this kind of long legs as opposed to webbed feet? It tells you something about where they live, and that's a great educational tool. We unveiled this tree exhibit on Earth Day 2023. It features a chunk of fallen tree from over near the tennis courts that illustrates how it lived and how long it lived, which is about 116 years from our best estimate, and how much Elgin history it saw, and a sliding panel that demonstrates just how much of Elgin's tree canopy has been lost from development to today. Our endangered species exhibit was renovated a year ago, featuring a habitat mural by artist Heather Dorsch. and drawings and research by local school kids. And this exhibit won a 2024 Mayor's Award for preservation. Our newest exhibit to be unveiled was in April, and it's a renovation of our LaSalle room, commemorating the 1970s recreation of LaSalle's expedition by Larkin High School French teacher Reed Lewis and a crew of students. We needed this exhibit to be relevant to today, and it focuses, therefore, on sweeping global changes that resulted from the early trade between Native Americans and Europeans, also owning up to the negative impact on Native American cultures and the environment. In the encounter, both authentic and replica Native American tools are shown with their European counterparts for kids to figure out the before and the after. And a key question to contemplate from this exhibit is how we are living through a similar moment in human history right now, as all of our ways of life change rapidly with technological advances and now artificial intelligence. We do many cultural events at EPM, including annual observations of Juneteenth, Indigenous Peoples Day, and Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. And in addition, we have lecture programs for adults and for programs for families together, and especially aimed at toddlers, story times and crafts. Our education programs for all sorts of schools, public, private, parochial, and homeschool, and Scouts and the community are still the heart and soul of why we do what we do. Our unique location in the park means that sometimes nature programs can include outdoor hikes. We have a wonderful partnership with Friends of Lord's Park Zoo, who provide sponsorships for programs we host over at the zoo. And most important of these are Uncaged in the Zoo, in which animal presenters bring critters that kids of all ages, 3 to 103, can hold and touch. And resuming this very month, now that there are 2 bison at Lord's Park Zoo again, is Meet the Bison, in which you can get pretty much eyeball to eyeball with either Dakota or young Becky. I am accepting reservations for that, so get in touch if you'd like to be a part of it. Now, we do this all with just 2 of us currently on the payroll, myself and Assistant Abby Rasmussen. Abby, would you stand? Plus our board of directors, and from our board of directors, I'm trying to look around the room and I don't see so well, but we have President Judy Hayner, Judy, and Sarah Vetter, and Karen Jones, who is our treasurer. And am I missing anybody that I can't see back there? Mary, of course. Mary drove me here. Now she's not going to drive me home. Mary Sicer. And of course, we have several really reliable, magnificent, wonderful volunteers who are always there with us, making it possible for us to get stuff done. You can dream a lot, but you've got to have people to make it actually happen. So earlier I showed you a couple of George Lord collection pieces that I would like to reassure you are still very much with us and on exhibit. The giant Irish deer still looms over the check-in desk. And the 2 California condors are still upstairs. And I know there are a lot of familiar faces, mostly familiar faces to me here this evening, and some of you are museum members, and thus you get free admission anyway. But some of you may have never been to the museum or haven't been in many years. And I'm very grateful that you came here to the library tonight. But where I really, really need you is at the museum itself. That is how places like ours survive. So before you leave, see Miss Abby for a free pass. You can bring a couple of people on a free pass. And even if you're a member, take one and give it to a friend. And there's lots of other handouts back there. So in conclusion, I just want to say that I don't know where the button is. I walk to work every day, and it's always a wonderful feeling, that ambiance of Lord's Park very early in the morning. The wildlife, the zoo, the creek, the lagoons, the pavilion. Nowadays, of course, there's the aquatic center and the pool. There's tennis and pickleball. There are basketball courts. There are baseball fields. And I think often of George and Mary and how they made all of that happen. And by the way, it's always they. George was once quoted as saying, "Whatever we have done in Elgin, we have done with one mind and purpose. It is not Mr. Lord nor Mrs. Lord, but Mr. and Mrs. Lord." And I picture them strolling through the park in their turn of the century, 20th century attire, happy to see the park they gifted Elgin still exists, that there are still animals, including bison at the zoo, that the pavilion still stands, and the museum finally got its east wing, though not yet its north wing. And I imagine George turning to Mary and asking, "What in tarnation is pickleball?" Thank you so much, and I am happy to take any questions you might have. Anybody?